By 1 a.m., as the massive PLA 83rd Group Army of its active duty forces were smashing all military and also reactionary elements that were within their path, the PLAN Marine 1st Brigade was busy at this time by 1 a.m. forcing its way ashore with its recon and air assault battalions, and still in the process, as mentioned in previous installments, of capturing the port facilities mostly intact to begin to unload their heavier elements of their brigades, such as their heavier battalions and all of their equipment from their specially crafted cargo vessels upon which they had essentially been mounted up in. And the oil refineries were another massive boost to the overall operations that were occurring insofar as seizing the nation's critical assets, as again, the Americans had deployed forces to this and many other cities to defend such critical infrastructure, which wasn't only just limited to the different facilities as it related to the power grid and also the water and sewage treatment plants, but also to the transportation networks such as the air infrastructure, as airports were absolutely vital in terms of importance. Also, critical defense infrastructures, and also ports and energy facilities, which were at the top of the list or near there, near the level. As specific city had multiple different critical resources that needed to be defended. The PLA forces, along with the PLAN and the 36th PAP Brigade, a standard People's Armed Police brigade that was highly mobile and was an expert force in terms of crushing any types of insurgencies, as they had ample experience in this over the years, as any time hostile or restive elements would arise in the west of their nation. Generally speaking, they would absolutely outright annihilate these forces in the most brutal means possible. And they had transferred this skill set to the overall colonization operations that would be ongoing post-inevitable CCP victory in this campaign, as they also were conducting their own operations for the time being, primarily in the northwest of the city, but gradually pushing deep into the heart of its inner city area to begin capturing critical buildings of key significance and importance, as well as also cleansing the downtown area of armed reactionary civilian and American paramilitary elements, which were typically its alphabet forces, as well as any types of scattered military remains that would have made their way to the downtown area. However, the strike into the city of Houston would be of such a more rapid nature than many other battles that had been occurring that no coherent defenses could be established in the inner city area due to the shocking speed of the advance, especially of the People's Armed Police forces equipped with their highly mobile wheeled WZ-551 armored fighting vehicles, both the IFV variant with its very potent 25mm autocannon, along with its 7.62 by 54mm coax on a remote-controlled turret controlled by the gunner of the vehicle, as well as also the APC versions, which had a heavy machine gun turret wherein a W85 12.7mm heavy machine gun could be placed. As these forces were also heavily supported by the constellation of ISR drones, enabling them to see and get the drop on all enemies before the enemies had even knew what would hit them. They were also supported by their own dedicated combat drone section within their own headquarters battalion of their brigade, which could fire the TEL-like system, sending CH-901As into flight in a staggering number, able to fire 48 in a single volley from this system, as these would be supporting their actions not only against the armed reactionary civilian elements on either side of the 249 highway itself needing to be secured, as this would be a major key logistical route into the combat operations that were already beginning to unfold, as this outer battalion had cleared the outermost flanks of the inner city or inner metro area before heading into the actual city of Houston itself to begin their operations, and again capturing critical, key, vital buildings that were absolutely necessary to American defensive efforts, as well as to be able to secure other structures such as food, medical distribution sites, as well as even also TV stations for later use, and more, as well as also the police stations, as that could have been a vital asset to any type of defensive operations conducted by paramilitary elements of the Americans, as this elite shock force of paramilitary troops was racing down 249 as other forces cleared the flanks, especially in the south of the 3rd Squadron of the Americans that was backed up by a spread out element of over 200 armed reactionary civilians. Additional armed reactionary civilians to the north of the highway still posed a threat, as they needed to be dealt with immediately, the same as armed reactionary civilians all throughout the map needed to be dealt with by the rest of the invasion forces, as again, this was tailored into the war planning naturally, because these forces still, although not posing nearly the type of threat that the actual military and American paramilitary elements posed, they still were a threat because they would end up being the future saboteurs or the future partisans that would try to thwart the economic exploitation of the newly conquered territories during the colonization phase. And no partisan uprisings or insurgencies, in other words, could be tolerated by the occupation forces. Hence why the PAP, the regime's shock forces, an expert counterinsurgency force, which was also armed in such a way they could go toe-to-toe with actual military units as well, were an integral part of the operations, including the colonization phase, prepping and laying the groundwork for such to occur, alongside of their military cohorts of the regular PLA military forces, as this was the most elite of China's different paramilitary arms, with most of the rest being more akin to a National Guard-like entity as it pertained to the other paramilitary branches like the National Militia, Marine Militia, National Construction and Production Corps, and many others, as they had multiple different paramilitary forces, with the People's Armed Police being the cream of the crop of the regime's fighting forces as its Praetorian Guard-like assets, as these forces were already by 12:40 a.m. beginning their clashes with the 3rd Squadron and armed reactionary civilian elements, having fled in their wake, as they were naturally committing many different brutal acts in their AO. These forces in the north, by 1 a.m., had moved into this area, frightening many armed reactionary civilians and even unarmed refugees now fleeing through the area into an area where they were about to become boxed in, as the ISR assets looming over the battlefield, including this WZ-8 that circled this general area, had spotted massive movements of vehicles and foot-based traffic all throughout this portion of the city's core metro area, as all of the different civilians, both armed and unarmed, reactionary and also the more intelligent, who were trying to flee the area so that they could regroup and get organized and start learning how to operate in a low-tech environment, as they now utterly and completely lacked communications and ISR networks. These forces here were about to be boxed in by a single one of these two battalions, as one battalion spotting them moving in and around a upscale neighborhood that was within a thickly wooded area, as oftentimes there were many upscale suburban neighborhoods built in this type of terrain, this one being no different, was about to be encircled by some of the comprising combat companies, as each battalion had 7 of these combat mechanized infantry-like companies, of these lighter mechanized infantry-like elements of the People's Armed Police, with another battalion sweeping the outer area for any fleeing elements that didn't get trapped in the cordon and sweep operation, as the beginning of the cordon and sweep required the different companies to box these forces in by moving to the north and south and then closing the loop as they would move to the slight south or south and slightly west to box in these forces as it pertained to those that had been spotted transiting this area of rather wealthy upscale homes in this neighborhood that was located in a thickly wooded and somewhat hilly area. As in this particular part of the core metro area, being that it was further away from the sea, there was some hilly terrain, and some of it, including the terrain in this specific neighborhood, being even steep in some places where there were ridge lines, and although the hills were not incredibly high hills, they were still tall enough where the varied terrain features could be utilized by the armed reactionary civilian elements in any type of defensive operations, although again, these forces had been surprised very early on by the invasion, many being startled from their sleep, and most of them woefully unprepared, only able to carry as much ammunition on them as they physically could carry, as well as also having a wide array of different small arms, and some were better prepared than others with their not only having experience or training from the former time in the military or not, of those who had none. Also, the equipment varied between these armed reactionary civilian forces. Very few of them were prepared with body armor and plate carriers, although some were, and those who were obviously would fare better than those who were not, who would be easily cut down by the hail of fire they would sustain. As the different forces of the PLA were fighting their way through the city, capturing key objectives and wresting control of the city's highways from the local defending forces of the National Guard troops, causing many civilians to abandon their vehicles on the highways and flee in multiple directions, as many vehicles sat riddled with holes and smoking, while the different National Guard forces tried to put up valiant stands to defend these areas as best as they could. Many were simply brushed aside, and the armed reactionary civilians were no different, not only with these very well-equipped PLA forces, including with their armor, their mechanized infantry, their combat engineers, their air defense forces, their ginormous gargantuan artillery forces, and more, but their air power as well. And all of this was smashing enemy forces, and the People's Armed Police were experts and were very akin to a form of combat dental floss, able to get in there and root out the plaque and do the nitty-gritty up close and dirty work associated with close quarters battle and combat, as they had ample experience with clearing buildings of hostile elements and also utilizing their heavy weapons in horrifying ways against insurgents and partisan type elements, as they had ample experience in these types of operations, again, from their long and sordid history of these sorts of things. As the city, in many areas, was being heavily hit by all manner of artillery and carpet munitioning, most of it with its buildings pancaking inward or being thrown weightlessly in multiple directions, with gutted buildings where the innards of these buildings could be seen, within the inner floors collapsing, parts of them being thrown in other directions, while the buildings on the outskirts became gutted and pancaked in on themselves or spilled out into the streets, like the building adjacent to this one that's about to be hit, with this one across the street behind it in the process of being blasted. The suburban areas didn't fare much better, as the artillery and carpet munitioning reached them as well, and also even the torching of multiple homes or being struck by mortar strikes from 82 millimeter mortars, or if from the PLA, frequently by 120 millimeter mortars, which were even larger and more destructive, as the 82 millimeter mortar was already quite a large mortar round. As to the south of 249, the route upon which one battalion was hurriedly striking with its wheeled vehicles, which had a high rate of speed and maneuverability and were nimble and could really get into certain areas where heavy tracked vehicles often couldn't. The People's Armed Police WZ-551s raced down 249 and into the downtown area to engage in battle against other reactionary armed civilian elements, while the 4 battalions, 2 in the south, fighting the 3rd Squadron and destroying its armored forces, including its mechanized infantry with their Bradleys and their M113 APCs, which their rocket-propelled grenades were even enough to annihilate, with their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles able to destroy the Bradleys and tanks. They were also supported from the air by the Wing Lung dedicated combat drones, which fired the CM502 KGs at these tanks, along with the People's Armed Police firing their HJ-08s at many of these vehicles, especially the tanks, with their rocket-propelled grenade fire, and flamethrowers torching many buildings and vehicles as well, such as in the case where this technical has essentially been fried in the backyard of this suburban home, with their ISR assets monitoring the entire battle space, aiding them in their deployment of their weapons, including their light machine guns and small arms like their rifles, as well as also their 35 millimeter barrel-fired grenades from tubes beneath their rifle barrels, rocket-propelled grenades, both AP and AT, or anti-tank or anti-armor rounds. Although they couldn't quite destroy a tank, they had the possibility of blasting the tracks, which could immobilize one to be hit by an anti-tank missile, or the anti-tank missiles just destroyed them completely. And they were supported heavily by CH-901As, which were produced in enormous quantities, especially in preparation for this invasion, and were highly effective weapons, and could be utilized against heavily armored vehicles with their heat warheads and bunkers and even rubble buildings that had been collapsed, as certain building materials couldn't withstand the heat rounds if in certain areas. And the HE round was often enough to destroy lighter armored vehicles like the M113s, the MRAPs, by crashing down on their roofs and destroying them, along with groupings of troops, which the fragmentation warhead, which was designed to produce maximum shrapnel effect, was ideal for use against light-skinned vehicles and clusters of enemy infantry. However, with most of the CH-901As being fired at this time equipped with the heat warheads to deal with the armored threat from the 3rd Squadron in support of the 2 battalions of the brigade striking them on the flanks of the advancing battalion racing down 249. To the north, the heat warheads from the initial volley fired by the headquarters also reached this battlefield and would support these forces even though they were being utilized against armed reactionary civilians. They would be enough to destroy houses within which these forces might be taking cover, as the houses were relatively large and more upscale in this area and very ornate. They, similar to the ones in this battlefield, were often hit with mortars or would be burned in an absolutely necessary case, although the People's Armed Police would often choose to just go in and clear them room by room in their stack team formations, which were their half squads, where a point man and 4 following would kick in doors and race into rooms or just simply throw in a hand grenade before going in to clear these rooms of armed combatants, as this point man stepping off to the side of the stack team and throwing one in this room where there's 2 armed men, one trying to stand by this door on the opposite side of the doorway and one hiding further back. Hand grenade easily being enough to dispatch both and leave the room in complete destruction. As the armored vehicles and the troops with their anti-armor weapons, as well as their flamethrowers, the Type 74s, could unleash a barrage of destruction themselves with the aid of their loitering munitions in the form of the CH-901A, as forces on this map, going to the actual battle map, had already again encircled this area, as the different comprising companies would conduct a classic cordon and sweep operation, which essentially was more or less a form of a hammer and anvil type maneuver or a search and destroy operation, but highly coordinated and organized in layman's terms. As in, they would race down an area and establish a cordon on each side, with this company's combat elements having had moved this way and then to the south with their headquarters platoon just off map. This one having raced this direction, leaving its headquarters off the map, and this one moving in from this direction with another platoon off map of their combat vehicles, of their WZ-551s, along with the headquarters. This is only 2 platoons right here. This is the part of the headquarters vehicles for this specific platoon, with their other vehicles off map with the other platoon. And this is the hammer force of 1 platoon of vehicles right here, and another here and another here. As this is higher ground, this is on a ridge line, with this being even higher up than this ground right here, upon which this street and these driveways protruding from it going to other homes are. This is the part of the headquarters of this company's combat forces right here. This is the WZ-8 high altitude stealth recon drone that helped them to find these enemy forces to begin with, to cordon this entire area to be able to sweep it with their hammer forces. While this one cordoned the north, this one cordoned coming from the north down to the south, and this one coming in from the west towards the east had met up here. And while this company, a whole different companies coming down from this area to assist in getting anybody that escaped the net that was outside of the net when it formed, as early on multiple actions are occurring, especially on the periphery of the cordon itself. This is a 1 by 1 mile area. This is a large area, and these vehicles are spaced out as relatively far as they can get, while still being able to have interlocking fields of fire to tactically support each other as it pertains to each and every vehicle of each platoon of each company. With this company having more vehicles off map, its lead platoon with these vehicles being 2 platoons and their headquarters platoon following behind across this creek, which is on higher ground than where this force is going, which would eventually intercept these fleeing armed reactionary civilians. This group initially tried to attack the outer cordon forces as they had destroyed this house as they fought their way to the south to set up this cordon. They had destroyed this house in the process, while this swimming pool and pool house here had been essentially left alone because there was no fire coming from there, but they had overrun this area. They dismounted some of their squads to provide support behind their vehicles or be able to fire around them to support them from the front from any frontal attacks. As all the vehicles oriented their fire inward on the cordoned area to essentially assure that nobody escaped, while this company's coming down out of the 5 total in this area. This is the 5th, coming down to net anyone that made it out of the net, out of the cordon. And there were still 2 other combat companies and the headquarters and support company of the entire battalion. And then there was a whole other battalion. This just came from 1 battalion. This is just the larger part of a single PAP battalion out of the 2. They also had some of the heat warhead equipped CH-901As in this particular area, as there were a total of 10 of them in this area from the 48 fired, with all the rest going to the south to support against the 3rd Squadron out of the 48. But these were supporting their troops in this cordon and sweep. With this platoon moving up this street between these large homes, these are all 2,700 square feet or larger. Most of them are 3,200 square feet. These are large homes. They have swimming pools in some cases, like this one and this one. And this one that was destroyed due to them having to move through the area. It was in the way, and they were taking fire from it, so they annihilated this home. They destroyed it with 25mm autocannon fire and calling in mortar strikes from the mortar company of the headquarters battalion, as their fire support company wasn't within their mechanized infantry type battalions, but was within their headquarters battalion at the brigade level. So these forces moving in were going to eventually get these guys, as their ISR assets spotted them fleeing from this heavily wooded area. It was October, it was fall, and although there was thick undergrowth and foliage that they could hide in, if they were disciplined enough to stay still, it could obscure temporarily their IR signatures from the myriad of quadcopter assets flying overhead, or if they were smart enough to get under the evergreen type trees, the coniferous pine type trees, that too would have obscured their signatures. However, many of them were constantly moving and thus could be spotted in this densely wooded neighborhood. Had many of them actually thought things through or learned about infrared and how to camouflage their infrared signatures, they would have understood that they needed to remain still and remain well hidden beneath such types of plants or dense undergrowth, as there was plenty still, even though it was fall and many trees had discarded their leaf in the area. Their leaves had fallen, such as the leaf litter that these guys are laying in. As you can see, the yellows and reds. They were not that self-disciplined in many instances, and while these platoons had dismounted all their squads, including even this platoon staying back to watch this area with their fields of fire, they dismounted 1 platoon from their platoon's IFV, who was at the very beginning conducting against this grouping right here. They were conducting a closing L formation, hence these arrows. They were already firing and getting return fire from across this creek bed. They were firing at each other, but the closing L moving in eventually annihilated this grouping of about 15 different armed reactionary civilians, as these guys had heavier weapons and they were wearing body armor. They had 1 wounded man due to return fire, but they were using tactics along with the heavy fire coming from their vehicle in between that just annihilated these guys with 25 fire, but then they backed off the 25 fire as these guys got closer with the 25 autocannon, and then they threw grenades and destroyed the rest if there were any survivors, most of them probably wounded by that point if they were even still alive. By now, this squad of this platoon here had already cleared this large mansion with the headquarters troops dismounting from their vehicles and milling about, checking it out. As these troops dismounted 2 half squads from their vehicles here and here, this one not dismounting any, with this one having their full squad behind it, this one having a full squad, full squad, full squad. And they were watching around both the back of the vehicle in their rolling shield double column formation, and as these forces were coming down the hill and engaging these hiding in the undergrowth, this loitering munition came in and struck them in conjunction with these forces pincering them and delivering X-vectored fire against these forces. With the aid of this, completely annihilated them. whereby these forces then began to move parallel to the vehicles that now filed into a single file as they were traveling in this valley, as this ridge was about 40 feet high, and the higher level of this terrain was even higher at about 55 feet, and this was somewhat steep land, although it had gradual slopes in some places like here. As these guys were firing in their closing L, the fire was impacting the land and this ridge, and also this gradual sloping hill right here. And as they were moving at the opening of this map, they had fired this direction before these forces had moved up and into the area, helping to eliminate these personnel before climbing the ridge line and about to assist this squad moving up with dealing with these forces who were promptly impacted by two different heat warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions. As they were clearing the ridge top, these two squads, this rolling T watching both floors of this two-floor house, as the point man in the middle watched the first floor and these guys on the ends watched the top floors on the rolling T. That was a good formation for watching the upper floors of buildings. This wedge formation bounded and kicked in the door and cleared the home, while this squad outside, as per SOPs, firing at these five, while this squad that came around through here from this squad, after they conducted and closed their closing L, as again, they closed the L here, which is when they would yell limit of advance, so no one continues and keeps firing and causes friendly fire, as that's the type of tactical formation they were using, is the closing L, which they could vector fire this way and this way, which, again, the fire impacted into the side of the hill, as the AI systems and the ISR assets directed everything that was done, as the AI could advise the troops, when it was safe to fire based on angle and traverse of weapons, the types of weapons used, etc. So as the IFV backed off their 25mm autocannon fire as these guys got closer to close their L, most of these guys have been KIA'd, and although again they wounded one of these soldiers, they didn't have much success between the vehicle-based fire from this heavily armored vehicle and the closing L formation, which was an ideal tactical formation for closing in on enemy forces. While these forces moved up the hill, bounding and covering tactically together, with this one bounding first at the crest of the hill, then this one bounding ahead, while they then took fire and returned fire as these loitering munitions came in and supported them, destroying them. At the same time, as this rolling T and the closing L, after consolidating into a full squad, came as a wedge formation around this house, they opened fire from this angle, the rolling T opened fire from here. And again, rounds would just slam into the earth at this point because there was a steep ridge behind this house and its property. As these houses were built in a heavily wooded area, some had lawns like right here, but the rest of it was heavily wooded, as this was high terrain, as this is a ridge that runs through this neighborhood, and when they moved through this area, their wheeled vehicles could climb this ridge because there was gradually sloping terrain here, and then the rest could come down. This group could come down by this street right here, where the other company did the same, but started turning this way first before they got here, and then this company came and closed the cordon and trapped all these armed reactionary civilians in it who had no idea that these guys were trapping them in a cordon and sweep operation. They had no communications, no ISR capabilities whatsoever at all. They had no idea they were being even surrounded, and they were about to be flushed out by these different squads moving against them with loitering munitions and heavy armored vehicle-based firepower, including heavy machine guns, 25mm autocannons, and more, with flamethrowers, anti-tank missiles, and anti-armor weapons, which had anti-personnel rounds like the Type 69 RPGs, the HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which were more or less not used a whole lot in this because the RPGs were sufficient, as were the flamethrowers that would be used as some of the troops deployed with their flamethrowers. At the opening of this map, 4 different mortars came down and destroyed this house right here. These guys were all KIA'd by the house while these guys were moving through the area and fleeing, and they broke into two groups coming from this way and this way on this high ground where this diamond formation was, which was actually a good formation as they were on high ground, and they had to watch these different routes. They came from one of the cordon companies, this company that was doing the cordon with other vehicles of the other platoon off map. They came from there, came up this ridge, and encountered these guys as they broke in their diamond formation and fired from this side and this side at these guys who were on higher ground than were these vehicles and troops, who also fired up and at them, vectoring fire at their side as indicated by this red, and then this arrow encapsulated in red, and this one in red means they were KIA'd, as these guys were using grenades, they were using Type 69 RPG anti-personnel rounds. They were using their 35 millimeter tube-fired barrel launch grenades that were beneath some of the rifle barrels of some of the men, and they were using, of course, their light machine gun. They annihilated these guys. These guys were not ready for what was coming at them, plus the heavy machine guns on these vehicles, the W-85 12.7 millimeter vectored at them from the side, as it pertained to this group of the guys on the hill that they could actually hit and see. They were being wiped out as they approached these guys who laid in the underbrush and basically ambushed them when they got close enough. And as that was going on, they did try to fire down and back at the vehicles from the higher ground, but they essentially did little to nothing, as their small arms couldn't penetrate the vehicles and might have maybe scratched the paint on them, but did nothing else. And these guys that they fired at too, these two troops of this half squad, they didn't hit either. Although had they hit them, they might have maybe slightly injured their ribs if they would have hit them center mass with some of the firearms they had, but not much more than that, as they wore body armor. So as this squad came around at the same time as this movement, and all of this movement at the beginning was taking place, and even this movement over here, as these troops are coming down this hill on this ridge line right here on this higher ground that was even higher than where these guys were by a little bit, they came down and attacked these guys with this squad doing their X-vectored fire before these vehicles had lined up from their wedge formation as they moved through this valley, all five of them being followed by a squad behind the IFV version, with the rest falling in behind them while these guys were clearing the ridge, tactically bounding and covering and wiping these guys out with loitering munitions support against these guys on the top of the ridge and against these guys in the valley below as these guys moved in and did their X-vectored fire, causing these guys to flee as they began to take fire right into this grouping of vehicles who vectored their heavy machine gun fire and annihilated them as they came up the hill. They could all be seen moving in a group up this hill, and they were annihilated once they reached the crest. They didn't even have a chance, and these guys fired at them from around this vehicle too. Totally interlocking fields of fire just cut these guys down. As these guys tried to hide in the underbrush, and then when they opened fire, they of course were seen doing so and were cut down one at a time, by which point these guys were patrolling the other side of this valley looking for enemy personnel after these guys had been scared up the side of the hill and were cut down. These armed reactionary civilians were not yet ready for high-intensity warfare, as armed reactionary civilians would perish in their many tens of thousands, even in the first 4 days. Eventually, they would get a grip, and they would realize they needed to reorganize because it was about continuity of resistance. It was not about what they could do at that moment. They realized that they needed to do better, and they needed to actually have a real plan, a real way to gather actionable intelligence. So they knew where the enemy was, what they were doing, and they, over time, would actually develop into capable forces, even though losses would still be heavy, because any time that ragtag partisan or insurgent type forces go up against a much more professional, much higher level of technology in terms of the forces and much more disciplined force, they always have high losses. It's a guarantee. It's been that way in every type of insurgency throughout human history. There's no difference. But they would be able to begin to really mete out sabotage and certain actions, including even ambushes, that would be somewhat successful. And then they would acquire heavy weapons, which they really didn't have this early on. It's literally only an hour into the invasion when this action is beginning, as the other action to the south by the other People's Armed Police battalions has started minutes before this one did, as they took time to get around and surround this 1 mile by 1 mile area. As normally they would do it a grid square at a time, as a grid square is a 1 by 1 kilometer area. These forces did it in a 1 by 1 mile area. As all of these actions were occurring over here, these actions were taking place with this grouping going to the edge. They were spotted as they fired down at these forces and were seen by ISR capabilities. These guys returned fire with their 25 millimeter autocannon and heavy machine guns, immediately causing some KIAs and forcing the rest to flee back, where a mortar strike had been promptly called into the area, which KIA'd more of them, although they weren't all KIA'd just yet, but they had been hit by a mortar strike, which eliminated those that didn't get KIA'd when they opened fire at the edge of the ridgeline here against these forces, who promptly returned heavy machine gun and 25 millimeter autocannon fire, and of course 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax from the IFV of this platoon of vehicles here. At the same time as this happened, these guys out here were barbecued by the Type 74 flamethrower that equipped one of these soldiers in the squad of dismounts that dismounted behind this pool house by this ridge right here to guard the back end of their vehicle that was facing this direction, as well as they could also fire around if need be too. So they used their flamethrower against these forces that were in this area trying to ambush these vehicles. They fired at this one from the back, causing these guys to fire at them, along with their small arms fire up at them in 35 millimeter grenade, tube-fired grenades at them as well. Type 69 anti-personnel rocket-propelled grenade rounds, and these guys were being gradually fried alive by the flamethrower, which was a horrifying way to perish, and it was a horrifying weapon to be on the receiving end of, which KIA'd all of these guys with the combo of the munitions used as well as the flamethrower used by these troops that were dismounted to protect the back of their vehicles. And these guys had fled due to seeing all the carnage around them with what happened to these soldiers. These vehicles didn't even bat an eye and turn because they were only using small arms anyway. It did nothing to these vehicles. And these guys in turn were KIA'd. They gave up their position seen by the ISR assets as they had been laying in wait in the undergrowth and had just been missed by some of the quadcopters that were patrolling the area by these vehicle crews and squads, and they had enough discipline to stay low while these forces came in and surrounded the area. But as these forces fled, the jig was up. They had been spotted, as the saying goes, and this company moving into the area from the north would intercept and destroy the rest of these 12 that had fled the area in two groupings, one ending up going this way and one going this way, right into these forces that were coming for them to get anybody who didn't get netted in this cordon and sweep operation to begin with, because that's what they were coming in to do. Anyhow, with the other two combat companies doing similar in the north and south out of the 5, because there were 7, and the headquarters and support company of the entire battalion stayed off map, and there was a whole other battalion out of the 2 that attacked this general area as well that were also off map and to that way. With the headquarters of this attacking battalion doing this cordon and sweep operation, which is a classic hammer and anvil operation or search and destroy operation, again in layman's terms, although this operation was a favorite of forces during counterinsurgency sweeps. It was also used against actual military forces, any chance that there was to do so. As these vehicles moved up and this squad remained in a double column rolling shield, they peeled off and climbed slightly up on the ridge and attacked some of these forces while their vehicles fired from the front. Their IFV firing its powerful 25 millimeter autocannon round at these 3 here, while these troops came in from the side and fired at them and these troops in front of them. As there was forces over here spotted by the ISR assets, as they could see some stirring in the shrubs and foliage, they fired a mortar, an 82 millimeter mortar from their headquarters battalion's fire support company, which was an 82 millimeter mortar company, which landed and splashed and KIA'd the rest of these guys as the fire came down from the side of the ridge at them. And then the vehicles proceeded to move up again. As they were already firing into this area, mortar strikes were being called in as well, because now it was understood that there was movement going on, which forced these guys to flee right into the fire as these squads were moving through the valley on the other side and were to come up and clear this higher ground. as these forces had not yet attacked this group, but attacked this group all the way over here. This was a lot of land. This was a 1 by 1 mile area, so they hadn't made their way to this edge yet by this street, but they had already done so over here and had gotten a lot of return fire, including even a mortar strike, and many of them had been KIA'd, but there were still a few left. As these guys bounded and covered towards this higher ground, the vehicles moved forward and attacked other groupings at the end of the valley, as this was higher ground right here where this stream flowed down from, and the mortar strikes had come in, again caused these guys to flee into the fire, as the squad that peeled off from the back of the IFV was now bounding this direction. They were firing at these guys here. And while these guys had not all been KIA'd yet, as this grouping here had been KIA'd, including from the 2 squads, that this squad from this other platoon's IFV and the squad that cleared this house came out after these guys had been KIA'd by this squad that from this IFV and this rolling T from this platoon here, from this APC on this side as they're dismounting from it. This rolling T would continue this way alongside their 5 vehicles, and this wedge formation would come out with the squad that did the closing L on these personnel. As they moved here, they both went up together in a 2-squad group, and they then bounded with these guys after they had wiped these guys out, and these guys had helped wipe these guys out. These 2 squads bounding and covering further up in the higher ground, firing at these guys along with the help from these 2 squads. They then all worked together with these 2 squads going this way, and these 2 squads working together, fanning out this way, and attacked the enemies on the top of this hill. And because they were on higher ground, they didn't go all the way up, but they just fired in this direction, this way and this way. X-vectored fire, and it was safe to do so without risking their own troops, who on the other high ground over here, on this ridge, this was thickly wooded, had by now already used their flamethrower on these personnel after the mortars came down and destroyed this house. 4 different mortar strikes killed these guys here. The KIA'd them. They used their flamethrower as this squad and this squad had cleared this house and the enemies behind it, with this squad that was the rolling T going this direction, using their flamethrower and grenades, their 35mm grenades, uphill and firing their small arms at enemies along the ridge line, while this squad went around and fired at them from this side and fired at these personnel up here. As they could see them with their quadcopter assets, they knew they were there. They could see them stirring around, and they had fired at them. At the opening, these 2 technicals had been destroyed. This one tried to go down the road and do a kamikaze charge with Molotov men in the back, but got cut down by a few 25mm autocannon shells that just blasted this truck into pieces, along with this one. While these ATVs came down the hill here, fleeing this general area, while these forces were moving up it, they had been taken out by vehicle-based fire from these vehicles. These vehicles had shredded up these ATVs and personnel that were following behind. At the opening of the map, you can see that these guys had already been KIA'd as they had been spotted from the vehicles at the opening of the map, and vehicle-based fire was directed in this direction. Mortars were then directed as these vehicles moved up and these guys were spotted. There's so many different things happening at the same time that showing them in any order is difficult to articulate, but it is being attempted, as these guys at the opening of the map had gone down here trying to break through and get out of this cordon as they had seen these forces lining up here. They'd all been KIA'd coming down this hill as they'd been spotted. The troops behind this vehicle fired at them. Although they've returned fire, they did nothing to these vehicles. These guys at the opening were all KIA'd by this vehicle vectoring fire this way and this one vectoring fire this way, as did this one. This house had been completely annihilated, gutted, while these personnel fleeing out from behind it had been cut down by a hail of fire coming from this way and this way. This house was destroyed at the opening. This vehicle tried to flee this way and was cut down by fire, even though they tried to fire at these vehicles again. They were equipped with small arms. They could do nothing to these vehicles, really. only those with Molotovs could have, and there were very few of them that even had any, including those in this technical that tried to flee and fight these personnel here. They had to have the implements literally in front of them this early on to be able to make enough of them, or any at all, like the actual petrol, the bottles, and the what they needed for the fuse mech, and most people didn't have that sitting right in front of them. It was difficult to put them together. So they had cut these guys down and were taking control of this hill up here, with assistance, again, from loitering munitions circling the area looking for prey. And as this squad, the Rolling T, bounded this way after the vehicles had finished off these all-terrain vehicles, which each had 2 men on them, along with this grouping following behind them, as well as these guys getting KIA'd right off the bat from the vehicles, with the rest getting destroyed with these ATVs as they're running right behind them, as the arrows encapsulated in red indicate. This squad then came out and basically provided the vehicles mutual support, as the dismounted infantry squad provided support and the vehicles provided them support. The mortar strikes came in and cut these guys down. The enemies behind this house were being assaulted by the squad peeling off from behind the ATV going for them, while the squads that finished off these guys with their flamethrowers and other munition-based weapons and small arms had advanced this direction. They fired down and into them, while this squad watched their flanks moving this way, bounding and covering with them tactically, and coordinating all their actions through radio and their handheld PDAs of the combat data links that their non-commissioned officers possessed of these different squads. So they could see everything through the ISR network that was processed all by the AI systems that processed various domains and dimensions of the battlefield that was ongoing, and sent it down through the combat data links to the forces in the field, aiding them in their deployment of forces, making them exceedingly flexible and very well executed in terms of their operations. As these squads now move through the area here, this being 2 squads and this being the other 2 squads, they now finished off this grouping with small arms and munition-based weapons before they fanned out again into 4 squad elements to help finish off these guys in the valley, as they were now being fired at from the troops on the side of this ridge line and the vehicle-based fires. They tried to return fire the best they could, but mortar strikes came in and KIA'd them with 25mm and 12.7mm based fires from the vehicles, and all the fire coming from these troops. And now they were outflanked and being fired at in a classic L shape from all of these dismounted squads. These 3, this one, and the vehicle-based fires coming from the vehicles that were now in a herringbone formation, as they had enough room to conduct that maneuver, while these squads, these 2, they moved through the valley floor on this side, now bounded and covered tactically to engage who was even left of these forces on this hill. And eventually they maneuvered into an L-shaped vector of fire. As they were on higher ground, it was safe to fire over this area here, and they were advised on how to vector their fire to where it wouldn't fly too far and into these forces. But again, remember, this is a 1 by 1 mile area. While the ammunition could fly quite a ways, it was unlikely as long as their angle and traverse of weapons was kept in check. And again, they were able to do this through their combat data links, their AI data processing system, which advised them on how and when and where to deploy weapons safely to cut down on friendly fire incidents. So if they fired them on this higher ground, which was even higher up than these forces, generally speaking, it was done in a very safe manner as they closed in on the last survivors, traversing their weapons slightly downwards so that they wouldn't just completely fly all the way over here. While these guys did similar, but fired down and into this valley, along with the fire coming from these guys, which if it missed these personnel, it just slammed up against this ridge line, as this was relatively steep ground, and did not hit their troops on the other side. It was all executed flawlessly with extreme precision. As these guys had fled this house, these guys had been KIA'd early on for exchanging fire with these forces who returned fire into them. As they fled, they were intercepted by vehicle-based fire, and the flamethrowers ended up being used against these personnel here as these squads closed in on them. So loitering munition got these guys with fire coming from this staggered formation of two different half squads. This squad was in a staggered column formation on either side of the vehicle, firing this way with their vehicle-based fire, interlocking fields of fire. They got these guys with the assistance of a loitering munition strike, a mortar strike, and another loitering munition hitting enemy forces on top of this higher ground here as they closed in and fired at these forces this way with their flamethrowers and small arms as they did the same to these forces on the higher ground before moving in as this loitering munition and mortar got the rest of them as they were firing at them from this way, and then they fired down and into these forces with flamethrower, and these guys used their flamethrower as well as they moved in and got closer. And as that happened, these guys had all been KIA'd by the hail of fire going into them from this way and this way. Again, if the fire was not hitting them exactly, it was just slamming into the earth as the fire was vectored safely into an area where it would hit the ground and not their troops, which are higher up. So all of this was done flawlessly, perfectly tactically executed. And all of these forces were, by which point, annihilated, including those on top of this higher ground, which had even survived from moving here and getting fired at by these forces, causing them back into this area where a mortar landed and cut down more of them. As these forces bounded and covered up this terrain, they cut down this grouping here, which had tried to lay in wait for them and return fire on them, and it managed to KIA a couple PAP troops, but the losses of the PAP were incredibly small at this point, as all they had was small arms, and they had to get some good shots in other words, they had to get very good shots that got them in the face or head area, the cranial area, or had to get an artery or something to cause them to bleed out. Otherwise, they had very good body armor, which could absorb a lot of the fire that was taken if it even hit them at all, as firing and moving targets is exceedingly difficult to do, and do so successfully. As these guys came around and did their closing yell, they finished off who was ever even still alive. As a PAP had successfully wrapped this operation up, with one battalion element conducting the cordon and sweep, as they went through the valley methodically in this valley and went through this valley methodically between this higher ground here, right here, and this higher ground here. They had successfully finished off what could have been a threat to their forces in the sense of sabotage or saboteurs who could have tried to interfere with logistical shipments for their forces fighting deeper in the city, as very few armed reactionary civilian elements remained in this area beyond the massive cordon and sweep that had occurred, most of the rest being in the inner city area that were by this point rising up in this area and trying to fight, while many others had fled this area and ended up fighting here, making a stand with the 3rd Squadron as they felt they could do so with the assistance of military forces, and others being swept up in a cordon and sweep and being destroyed, similar to what happened up here in an outer suburban neighborhood, before the rest of this battalion raced into the city to basically clear it of reactionary elements, along with enormous artillery strikes anywhere where enemy activity was seen by the PLA artillery forces of the 83rd and all the other independent artillery battalions within each and every combined arms brigade of the 83rd PLA Group Army. In the next video, the battle that occurred in the Channel View area will be going over between the 2nd of the 156th and elements of the PLA's 58th Combined Arms Brigade's armored battalion, smashing into them from across the San Jacinto River between the Lake Houston and the Galveston Bay area here. Next video.